Right, greetings, hello. It's Thomas Staffen here, my weekly Fasting Sunday address. And this week I thought I'd be in the garden because it's such a beautiful summer day. I'm here in La Creuse, a beautiful part of France, not really well known. It's a sort of hidden gem in the middle of France. And let me start by telling you a little bit about it. So it's in the geographical centre of France, and it is, equidistant really from all parts of France, which is one of the beautiful reasons why I came to settle here. It's quite a, it's not really well known by the tourists. They don't come here. It's what's called France profonde. It's deep countryside. Rural, but there are beautiful little towns, and there's a departmental capital, a town called Kerry, which has got everything you need. And generally speaking, it's a haven for artists, artisans, young people that are wanting to live in the country instead of in the big cities. And it's also one of the lowest incidents of COVID in the whole of France, which is obviously now miraculous, really. During World War II, it was a haven also for refugees fleeing from the Nazis in Paris. A lot of Jews escaped here and were sheltered by local people. And I noticed in the local paper recently an award was given to some French people for the fact that their family sheltered some Jewish refugees during the 1940s here in La Creuse. And Mandelbrot, the great French mathematician who went on to America, who gave us the maths behind fractals, he was one of those. He took shelter here in La Creuse during the war. So there's a sort of, it's a haven for intellectuals, dissenters. It's close to where the great novelist George Sand used to live, who was a romantic kind of socialist in the 19th century, a feminist, famous writer, not very well known in England, paradoxically, but she was a friend of Turgenev. And many of the great French writers and European writers of the 19th century would come to her place, which is now a museum not far from me. And it's also where Pierre Leroux lived, who was the mayor of my local town, Boussac, who was another utopian, romantic, visionary, a socialist, and a very learned man. He wrote, but self-educated. He was a printer. He looked forward to a sort of, the authentic aspirations of the French Revolution to become realized by liberty, equality, and fraternity. He was a Freemason, a Pythagorean, and he studied Oriental philosophy, a Buddhist, and so on. Typical French intellectual from La Creuse, actually. There's some really interesting people. There's a local chap who's written his biography. There's a documentary film being made about him, Pierre Leroux. He disagreed with Marx. He said Marx was wrong. You can't build paradise on earth if you ignore spirituality, if you ignore the Geist, as Hegel called it. And so he disagreed with that aspect of Marx, his doctrinaire materialism, as he called it. And I agree. I think Pierre Leroux is right. So was George Sand. I mean, Marx, although he was a genius, was just too fanatically wedded to his particular worldview. And also Heinrich Heine, a great German poet, was also in exile in Paris and knew Marx quite well. Heine also became a Freemason and believed in the moral reformation of humanity that had to accompany the outer technical scientific organization of humanity. You can't gerrymander society along regimentarian lines with just technocratic centralism and doctrinaire scientism. Heine said, no, that would be horrendous. No, let's keep the poets, let's keep the romantics, the visionaries, and I agree with Heine as well. I mean, Marx respected Heine. Heine was a much greater poet than him. Marx dabbled in poetry in his youth and in his teens, and he could have been a poet, but he was no way near as gifted as Heinrich Heine. It's a exciting time to be living here during this whole Brexit nonsense, and looking at life through a French lens. I mean, I'm a chameleon. I've lived all over the place. I've lived and travelled and worked in 35 countries. Most of my life I've been in the British Isles, but I've always lived there as an internationalist. I'm an exile from the kingdom of God, like we all are. And my real home is in paradise. I always joke to my students, I'll see you in the heavenly library if we don't meet up again in this life. My real home is the heavenly library. And Gershom Scholem also likes that joke. I'm sure he'll be there too, along with the other savants of history. So look, we've been having a terrible week. Extreme weather events seem to be becoming the norm. We've had terrible floods in Germany, Belgium, Netherlands. 200 people have died, swept away. We've all seen the photographs. The comment in the New York Times is that this is the new normal, that these extreme weather events are going to happen again and again and again. And they are caused by global warming. It creates more damp, more moisture, more rainfall. And the weather experts have said that the floods that have just hit Germany are a once in 1,000 years event. So it hasn't happened that bad for 1,000 years. Unfortunately, it's going to happen again. Simultaneously, we've got forest fires in Siberia that are like burning up the forest, the taiga. This is a precious resource for Russia, for humanity. And if that entire Siberian forest goes, it then adds hugely to the excess of carbon dioxide, which then causes a vicious cycle of further heating and further fires. This is a serious situation. The Russian state and Putin haven't taken global warming very seriously up to now. They've been sort of like denying it's got, it's part of the narrative that they're concerned with. But just recently, President Biden sent his envoy on climate change, John Kerry, to visit Moscow to talk to Putin. And I'm sure he's presented him with sufficient figures that Putin sat up and said, this is serious. And I know this because I attended a very important conference with Harvard University recently, organised by the Centre for the Intelligence Studies there. And it was a very high-level thing with lots of former intelligence agents quite high up. And apparently Biden has issued an important call for the American intelligence world to really focus on climate change as a problem. It's a global threat, and it presents huge security risks to all of us. It is the most important existential risk we face as a planet, and as a country. America knows that, and therefore top people were there from all over, including a former admiral who used to run the third fleet in the Pacific, who said that the climate change in the Arctic is 3 times as bad as anywhere else on the planet. There's a sort of negative feedback spiral going on. And the polar vortex, which keeps cold air up in the Arctic, has now deteriorated, and warm air is going up there now. So John Kerry knows all this. He was in that conversation which I attended, and he's now gone to Moscow, thank God, talked to Putin, and only then has Putin really begun to realise this is actually major stuff, and has authorised, for instance, that planes be sent to the Siberia forest fires, which have been struggling to cope alone without proper equipment. Thank you, Putin, for joining the effort. It's kind of important, this climate change, and I hope and pray that they can control the forest fires in Siberia. Of course, they're also happening in California. We even have a few going on in the Pyrenees, in the borders of Spain and France, and I'm sure in Greece and places. This is a major, serious problem. So the world needs to come together to tackle these problems together, not treat them in isolation. And we absolutely certainly shouldn't be, tormenting each other with threats and war fighting and bombings and all that. And I was appalled to read just recently that Netanyahu was trying to bully Trump into declaring war and attacking Iran just before he fell from power. Apparently Netanyahu was trying to, bully Trump into this as a right-wing Zionist kind of fanatic, as if, a war against Iran and between Iran and America is going to help anyone. I mean, only the most demented of pathological leaders would advocate a third world war like that, because Iran is in military alliance with other states, and America couldn't just bomb Iran and get away with it. We're talking World War III, and oh dear old demented Netanyahu, at least he's gone. He is a pathological crazy man who was trying to bring down the world like Hitler before. I refuse to leave my bunker. I'd rather see all Germany go up in flames. That was Hitler's view. It's kind of like Netanyahu, who refused even to leave his residence, his official prime ministerial residence, right up until like about 2 days ago. Blimey, and he's left so much chaos to clear up in Israel, and to get the talks between Israel and Palestine kick-started is so important. I'm working for that, having set up ICEPS, an international commission for the establishment of a Palestinian state, because, I've always been equidistant between Israel and Palestine. I love them both. I have many friends that are Palestinian, many friends who are Israeli. I've been there, I've talked to them all, well, some of them. I used to be active in London in Arab-Jewish Dialogue for Peace. We talked about Palestine. I've run meetings in the House of Lords on this. And I've always said, let's have a two-state, let's sit down and discuss that two-state solution. And during the Oslo Accord period, that looked like it was feasible. Then the extreme right killed off Rabin, who was the architect of that. And it's been downhill ever since. Likud came up, Israeli public opinion moved right, and sort of saw Palestinians as a kind of existential threat to their Israeli identity, which I think is totally false and misguided. We should stop doing all this othering on the planet. We should recognize that the other is myself, just in a different incarnational cycle. I could have been born a Palestinian or an Israeli, and I probably have in many lifetimes. I'm sure we all have. We're all everybody. We're all each other. The soul, the Atman, is not nationalistic in its coloration. It's universalistic in its orientation. And so we have a duty to our own future lives, so to speak, to be able to make the planet as beautiful and as healthful and as sane as anywhere else on the planet. So whether we're born in some future life in Siberia or Israel or Vancouver or Mexico or China or Palestine or Gaza, we want to be able to have a life which is meaningful, purposeful, deep, given to education, that we can access the world's store of knowledge, that we can fall in love and join the celebration and the joys of life. And that should be something for all children on this planet, regardless of your culture, religion, ethnicity, or social or class background. That was the point of Pierre Leroux, Georges Sand, and the French socialist tradition, and the communist tradition, was to create that égalité of the French Revolution. We just had Bastille Day here on the 14th of July, which is a big national celebration here in France, and people still take this seriously. Every town has a little statue to Marianne, who is the symbol of France, the symbol of the feminine, goal of equality, liberty, and fraternity. And just like every mother wants all their children to flourish and prosper, so every nation should want all their children to do the same. And so how can we do it, though? We're up against these extreme weather problems. We have these kind of crazy nationalists that want to bomb other countries, and they're still in power around the world. We have this guy in Brazil, this crazy Bolsonaro, who's a sort of militant of the right-wing variety, who was put in place by the CIA. They've admitted that in state hearings in Congress. I mean, you know, that sort of thing would take us all back downhill, back to, you know, what do you want? Do you want a world of inequality, unfreedom, and hatred? That's the opposite of what France stands for. Well, that seems to be what these people like Trump and Netanyahu want. They want a world based on hatred, inequality, elitism, continuing violence, continuing insecurity, and continuing poverty for, you know, those that aren't fortunate enough to be able to afford to fly planes and private jets around. I don't think the vast majority of us on planet Earth want that, but we're being, you know, demonized by a sort of scam elite. In England, it's called the Conservative Party, who've hijacked my constitution, hijacked the British people. And I've been discovering something very interesting, doing some research on the Conservative Party, trying to find their constitution. What do they actually believe, these people? Because I don't recognise where they're coming from. These Patel and all these people. They're not what I call conservatives. I used to know conservatives. I've had friends who are conservatives. You know, and they were decent, honourable people who believed in truth and morality. They just wanted to move towards progress at a slower pace than the revolutionaries. Okay, so people like Wordsworth and Walter Scott, you know, in the old days, and Disraeli and so on. Well, no, that lot have all gone, and I've been trying to find the statement of values in the current Conservative Party. Their constitution has no statement about any principles or values that they believe in. It's completely blank. All the other parties, Liberal Democrats, Greens, Labour, they all say what they believe in, you know, equality, justice for all, ending of huge social, you know, splits between different peoples based on their wealth and so on. You know, they're all working towards a roughly similar end. The SNP as well, and Plaid Cymru. And it's all in their constitution, so you can read it. The Conservative Party, their constitution has nothing. It's blank when it comes to what their statement of actual principles is. And that's brilliant for them, because it means they can do what the hell they like. They can do anything they want as long as the leader says, this is what we're doing. In other words, there is no grounding. It's like a ship that has completely just gone, you know, it's lost its rudder and it's just going in the wind like the Flying Dutchman, the current Conservative Party, and it's been taken over and hijacked by people without morality. Now, that is a unique situation. We didn't think that was going to happen in my lifetime, living in Britain. I thought there were certain ground rules that all politicians would adhere to, but no, apparently not. They can do what they want. The Conservative Party can, because they have nothing that you have to believe in to join or to be an MP within. So that's rather shocking, and I'm doing research on that at the moment. So that's where the World Intellectual Forum comes in, to give some kind of guidance, thinking through these kind of problems globally. What can the intellectuals of the planet contribute to the debates? Things like COVID, you know, where do we stand on things like vaccination or all the origin of this? And so we've set up a commission of investigation into COVID to find out about its etiology. I coordinate the Intellectual Forum in Europe. There are colleagues in other parts of the world. And I think it's quite important that we use our minds to access knowledge and information that is normally kept for an elite. Now we have things like the internet, we have publishing, we have amazing resources on the internet, we have you know, the literacy to understand the wisdom traditions of humanity and to make them available. And this is where education comes in, because most of us involved with the World Intellectual Forum are some kind of teachers or academics or professors, and we're devoted to education. That's why I do these broadcasts. You know, I'm a teacher, and I want to see the world flourish. I want young people today growing up to have hope, to have a sense of inheritance, a sense of belonging, that they've joined in with the, the world's intellectual resources. They can access them, and then benefit through a long life, well lived in the future. Because young people today are committing suicide. There's a huge epidemic of suffering and meaninglessness. You know, why am I alive? What's the point? I might as well kill myself. You know, we all go through that existential angst as teenagers a little bit, but it's got more serious than that. This is now like a major thing, and I'm just saying that education, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Through education and true scholarship and true wisdom, we can access the real heritage of man's spiritual and intellectual resources. That's what philosophers are for. That's what I'm for, as a signpost to that. And I was very happy yesterday to be involved in a discussion group online with a youth group called the International Peace Youth Group, IPYG. And it's a wonderful gathering of young people. This one was run from London. It was the UK chapter, but they're all over the place. I think it was started in Korea. So young people who are coming together and saying, we want peace. We're sick of these wars and this anxiety and all the problems that wars cause, like immigration and refugees and homelessness and child soldiers and, the chaos of all that. So there were 4 of us on the panel. I was one, and then we had some great other speakers who took part. I'd not met them before, but Jo Berry, who has set up the charity work to do with Britain and Ireland and peacemaking, she started because her father was killed by an IRA terrorist bomb, and she met the guy that planted the bomb, called Patrick McGee. She decided to go down the route of reconciliation instead of revenge, and she became an activist for peace. Amazing woman. She spoke to us. We also heard from Kerry O'Brien, who's working with the arts in London among disadvantaged youth, who, again, there's not much to do, there's unemployment, especially in this time of pandemic, what can you do? So she's trying to use the arts to get through and get a sense of inner peace, ultimately, and working through the traumas, working through the troubles in the family and so on. And then there was a lovely man from Liverpool, George McLean, I think he was called, who, again, an extraordinary activist working with youth. He runs a thing called the Yellow House in Liverpool, and he was inspired back by the Beatles in their day, this vision of a world based on values of peace and love, as John Lennon said, rather than conflict and constant war fighting. And so he's working with youth and theatre and working in prisons and doing this work all over Europe. So George spoke, and then, so the 4 of us spoke, and then there was some great questions from the group of 40 or so young people who wanted to know, well, what can they do, kind of stuff. And it was very heartening, actually, to see, and I hope that group, I'm sure it will flourish. It's got able leadership, and, it's part of a network of international young people trying to make a difference. And to try and demand peace, because that's our birthright. That's what we should all do. So another thing I've been busy with is, of course, my commentary on the Quran, which is ongoing. I love the Quran. It's an amazing book, and it's an amazing revelatory sequence. I've been working on it chronologically, and I've discovered that the sequence we have was written down in the time of Uthman, the 3rd Caliph, but actually the 4th Caliph, Ali, had already written a chronological edition of the Quran, but Uthman had insisted it be destroyed because he was a bit of a tyrant and didn't understand scholarship. You don't destroy variant versions, you keep them, and you work on what the original text was. I'm hoping Ali's chronological version was kept hidden in some cave in Iran or, the Kurdish mountains or somewhere. But meanwhile, I've been working on reconstructing it, in effect. And, it's interesting work, I have to say. And there are many levels of interpreting the Quran. It is a sacred text. And it's like a whole forest with different levels and layers. Like in the idea of forest gardening, there's the sort of level of what's going on the ground, there's the bush level, there's the sort of shrub level, then there's the tall trees level, and there's things happening at all levels. I've also completed my commentary on the 6 Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas and Mary Magdalene, as well as Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and finding many secrets in those. Again, levels of interpretation. As a philosopher, I'm looking at these texts sympathetically, but also critically. I'm asking, how do we know they're genuine? Are they real? What's the first copies we've ever found? How do we know they're authentic, etc.? And I've got the Mary Magdalene Studies Association conference coming up on the 22nd of July, just in a few days' time. We have some great speakers coming along, talking about Mary Magdalene and her legacy and her gospel. And one of our speakers, Anine van der Meers, discovered a gospel that was circulating in Cathar hands, and that she's commented on in great detail, written a 400-page book on. Anina was a disciple, student of Giles Quispel, one of the great scholars of Gnosticism in our era, who inspired me when I came across him, and was a personal friend of Carl Jung, helped get the Gospel of Thomas to Carl Jung. Quispel was an amazing scholar. And when I went to the Vatican Library, I discovered there's a secret room where they have the entire collection of the Brill collection on Gnosticism and Manichaean studies. And there's one volume dedicated to Giles Quispel's memory, including all his works on Valentinus Corpus and the Thomas Gospel and Syriac Christianity and the Coptic traditions, and, to die for. Anyway, Anina was his student, and she'll be talking about him and her research at our conference, which is on Zoom on the 22nd of July. If you want to come and haven't had an invite yet, email me or just go to our Facebook group, Mary Magdalene Studies Association. I put the Zoom link on there, and you'll need to join that. So that's exciting. And I've also done commentaries on the Dhammapada, the great Buddhist text. My reason for doing all this is to show up the universality of the wisdom traditions within each of the specific lineages, using my periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions as a kind of map, a guideline, then to go into as many as I can. I'm also doing a commentary on Das Kapital by Marx, because although I didn't agree with his epistemological materialism, he did flag up some serious abuses in the capitalist system. The incredible impoverishment of people that were forced into the factory system in the 19th century, without property, without land, without hope, and they were worked to death often. He also highlights the cruelties of the English against the Irish, and also against the Scots, and the Highland clearances and stuff. Marx knew quite a lot about all that, and he puts it in Das Kapital, which most people don't bother to read, actually. They just kind of know about it. It's actually very interesting if you read the text. So I've also been taking part in the Wisdom Keepers Forum, which meets every month with under the organisation of Satyen Raja, who runs it from Canada. And it's good. We're trying to say, well, what would we salvage? What can wisdom do to stop this pandemic of lies and ignorance that's negatively impacting on the planet? These problems are actually man-made. Even things like global warming, these are man-made problems, so we can unmake them. If we take the right kind of steps in our corporations, in our companies, in our cities, in our political organisations, our parties, our nations, we can come through this, we can pull through. I'm an optimist. But we do have to safeguard the wisdom that will get us through. About 20 years ago, I met some people in London who designed a thing called the box, which was similar. They wanted to say, what can we put in a box that will safeguard the collective wisdom of humanity? If everything was destroyed, all the planet's libraries, everything went up, what would be in the box that would be sent to, in a rocket to another planet? What could we save? Well, I have that box with me, and it's got amazing texts and poetry and writings and inspirational work and exercises and projects. This Wisdom Keepers, we're doing a similar thing, only we're updating the contents of the box, and we'll be making that public in a series of publications in the coming period. We were discussing existential risks at our last meeting, which is problems that affect humanity, risking our complete catastrophic destruction. Things like global warming, things like accidental nuclear war, things like a biological toxin being released from labs, like possibly this pandemic is caused by, and even other things like artificial intelligence taking over, and and enslaving humanity, and extraterrestrial objects coming in and crashing into the Earth and destroying life on the planet. These are existential risks. There's also the other one, which is a colourful one, but it's there, of some kind of alien civilization hijacking and colonising the planet without our even knowing it. I sometimes wonder if that's not, what happened to the Tory party. They seem to have been taken over by aliens, literally. So these are being studied by Cambridge University's Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. And we were talking about this. There are other groups in other universities. I've actually been doing this ever since the 90s, when I got involved with Philosophers for the Prevention of Nuclear Omnicide. Omnicide is the death of all. It's the self-destruction of humanity through an accidental nuclear exchange, or even an on-purpose one if you've got psychopathic leaders like Trump in charge, or Netanyahu. And so what can we do about these existential risks? That's what we were talking about. And really, in a nutshell, they're caused by ignorance. The solution is wisdom. And the delivery vehicle for wisdom is education of all kinds. The best kind of education is self-education. It's becoming your own teacher, your own tutor, figuring things out for yourself, studying, learning. But learning from others and with others is also good, because we don't all become solipsistic self-learners. Yes, we all are, but we have communities, we have colleges, we have schools, we have seminars, we have online Zoom forums, we have institutes. There's a social dimension to learning that's important too, because 5 people trying to figure out a problem are more likely to tackle it than just one, because each of the 5 can look at it from different angles and see things and suggestions that the others can't see. That's how we come up with collective intelligence. And so that's sort of what we're doing with the Wisdom Keepers. And as I say, the other thing I've been doing is the International Commission of Inquiry into the etiology of COVID. I want to know the origin of this thing, like objectively, scientifically, and absolutely. It's causing endless trauma, anxiety, difficulties. Ironically, the British Minister of Health has now got this. Having said, we're all coming out of lockdown, he's got it. The British Tory party, as I say, they've been taken over by aliens. They haven't got a clue what they're doing. They're like doing everything deliberately to mass cull the British people, it seems to me. Their latest scheme is to, allow this infection to spread, the new Delta thing, and that'll kill off loads. How crazy have you got to be to think like that? So there we are. There's a little roundup of news from La Creuse. This is the Wisdom News weekly broadcast. And I hope you find it interesting and, take away from this some hope. The other thing I've been working with is the Delphic Games. We're restarting with my friend Christian Kirsch in Berlin, and a committee. We're working on, relaunching the Delphic Games, which were like the Olympic Games of the mind. So you have the Delphic Games always in parallel in ancient Greece. For 1,000 years they went on. And that's poets, artists, painters, dancers, musicians, theatre people, all would go and compete. There was no cash prize. You got the laurel. You got your laurel to go round your head. That was all they needed. It was the kudos of having been and won that Delphic Games was enormous in Greece. And you couldn't compete unless your city was at peace during the Delphic Games. So it acted as a kind of truce, a universal truce